evening. You're watching the news from the Sultanate of Oman television. First, the headlines. The national economy achieves a growth of 4% during the 8th five-year plan period. The funeral of the President of Uzbekistan takes place in his home city of Samarkand. And Malaysia confirms its first case of Zika virus. Those were the headlines, and now for the news in detail. Despite oil price declines since the mid of 2014, the national economy has achieved a growth of 4% in current prices during the 8th five-year development plan. It was expected to achieve a 6% growth. However, oil price decline reduced the growth levels. In terms of the type of activity, the gross domestic product of oil activities in current prices recorded a growth of 2.6% against 8.7% for non-oil activities. Contrary to that, the domestic product of non-oil activities had not registered any retreat during the last 5 years, registering in 2015 around 19 billion Omani Riyal. This growth came as a result of economic policies adopted by the Sultanate to diversify its sources of income and its measures taken to improve business environment, as well as attract foreign investments and encourage domestic investments in the country. The service activities contribute to 70% of the gross domestic product for non-oil activities. The industrial activities also had registered continuous growth during the years of the 8th five-year development plan, recording 5.3 billion Riyal, benefiting from the Sultanate's attention to give incentives and necessary facilities for the development of industrial sector. The agriculture and fisheries sector also grew during the 8th five-year development plan as to reach 435 million Omani Riyal in 2015. The Sultanate, during the 8th five-year development plan, sought to increase the growth rate of gross domestic product and low preserving inflation rates. The statistics showed that inflation rates had stabilized during the last 3 years at 1%. The Sultanate also worked to raise the average individual share of local income, the issue that forced the government to increase the general expenditure of the 8th plan in order to reach more than 67 billion Riyal. The Sultanate focused during the current five-year development plan on diversifying some of the income through targeting 5 main sectors, namely manufacturing, transport and logistics, tourism, fisheries, wealth and mining. Central Bank of Oman, or CBO, announced that it intends to issue government development bonds, issue number 50, at a value of 100 million Omani Riyal for a maturity period of 6 years with annual interest of 5%. CBO said in a statement that the subscription will be opened from 18th to 26th of the current month, pointing out that the bonds will be issued through competitive subscriptions only, and investors should submit their bids through commercial banks working in the Sultanate during the subscription period. Muscat Securities Market will start tomorrow, Sunday, working with the Sharia-compliant index after developing it. The index includes the best 15 Sharia-compliant companies, according to Auditing and Review Authority for Islamic Financial Establishments. The new sample contains companies such as Oman Telecommunications Company, or Omantel, Reisut Cement Company, and Niswa and Ali's Banks. Analysts affirm that Sharia-compliant companies contributed to attracting a new regiment of investors as they fulfill their demands for dealing with Islamic financial tools. Islam Karimov, president of Uzbekistan for the past quarter of a century, was buried in his home city of Samarkand today. Earlier today, thousands of Uzbeks, many weeping, lined the streets of their capital today to watch the funeral cortege of President Islam Karimov, whose death leaves a power vacuum in a nation that serves as a bulwark against militancy in Central Asia. At dawn, a van carrying Karimov's body, who died of a stroke at age 78, drove slowly along Tashkent's main thoroughfare. Police officers stood at salute and people bowed down to lay roses and carnations on the roadside. Karimov, in power for more than a quarter of a century, was derided by Western governments as a dictator. But for many people in Uzbekistan, a mainly Muslim ex-Soviet state which borders Afghanistan, he is the only head of state they have ever known. Rebels from the Free Syrian Army took control of Taiba al-Imam, a northern Hama town, after clashes with government forces on Tuesday. Clashes continuing after midnight between regime forces and rebels around many fronts of the northern and western countryside, amid aerial bombardment on the area and the surroundings. Rebels took down the Syrian government flag from buildings in Taiba al-Imam, and military vehicles and tanks apparently abandoned by government forces. Turkey says 8 soldiers were killed and 8 wounded in clashes with Kurdish militants in the country's east. The governor's office of Van released a statement today on operations against members of the Kurdistan Workers' Party. The statement says 11 militants were killed in the operations around Tendurek mountain. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, whose Conservative Party faces possible defeat in an election in her home state on Sunday, rejected charges by anti-immigrant critics that her government was spending less on Germans due to a large influx of refugees. Merkel also strongly defended her decision to open the door to hundreds of thousands of refugees, mostly fleeing conflict in the Middle East. The big influx of refugees and migrants has dragged her approval ratings to a 5-year low of 45%. However, Merkel said that on the weekend in 2015, it was not about opening the border for everyone. It was about not shutting it to those who had made their way to them from Hungary and in great need of help. UNICEF says that new estimates suggest as many as 500,000 refugee and migrant children have turned to smugglers at some point on their journey since January 2015. A spokesperson for the UN Children's Fund said that the children had risked exploitation in the face of delays and desperation to reach European shores, with the smuggling now a big business across Europe and the Balkans. She added that unaccompanied children are particularly at risk of greater exploitation from smuggling, which can become trafficking. UNICEF also said that the new figure is based on a range of sources, including Europol, Interpol, testimonies from children themselves, publications from UN agencies, non-governmental organizations, and corroborated media reports.
Smuggling, which can become trafficking.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke today of their joint resolve to settle once and for all a territorial row over a string of tiny islands that has marred ties for more than 7 decades. In a speech delivered at a business conference in the Russian port city of Vladivostok, with Putin in attendance, Abe urged Putin to work with him to solve the dispute. Japan claims a string of Russia-controlled Western Pacific islands called the Northern Territories in Japan and Southern Kurils in Russia. The territorial row over the island chain, seized by Soviet troops at the end of World War II, has upset diplomatic relations ever since, preluding a formal peace treaty between the two countries. Putin said he was ready to take decisive steps to settle the dispute, though he cautioned that those steps could only be taken after careful preparation. Still to come in our news bulletin, the first British Airways direct flight from London landed in Tehran after nearly 4 years of suspension. Welcome back to the news from the Sultanate of Oman television. Malaysia confirmed on Thursday its first case of Zika after a woman tested positive for the virus following a 3-day visit to neighboring Singapore. The 58-year-old woman showed signs of a rash and fever 1 week after returning from Singapore. The health minister said this was the first confirmed case of Zika in the country. He said they have already intensified vector control activities in Taman Botani in Klang, where the infected woman's home is located, and urged residents to allow officers dispatched to the area to enter their homes and carry out fogging and spraying. China announced today that it has ratified the emissions cutting agreement reached last year in Paris, giving a big boost to efforts to bring the accord into effect by the end of this year. China is the top emitter of man-made carbon dioxide emissions, and the United States is second. Together, they produce 38% of the world's man-made carbon dioxide emissions. The agreement's long-term goal is to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius compared with pre-industrial times. Under the Paris Agreement, countries are required to set national targets for reducing or reining in their greenhouse gas emissions. Those targets aren't legally binding, but countries must report on their progress and update their targets every 5 years. SpaceX said it would shift Florida flights to a nearly completed second site after damage to its launch pad earlier from the explosion of a rocket belonging to the space services company run by Elon Musk. The Federal Aviation Administration spokesman said FAA has sent 7 people to Florida to supervise the investigation of the disaster. The agency, which oversees U.S. commercial rocket launches, requires that SpaceX's flights be suspended pending results of the probe. Any sign of rocket malfunction could require changes throughout the SpaceX fleet. Meanwhile, more than 70 missions aboard Falcon rockets worth more than $10 billion are on hold. The first British Airways direct flight from London landed in Tehran after nearly 4 years of suspension. The airline, owned by IAG, becomes the second European carrier to resume flights to Iran after Air France made the move in April, after a pause of 8 years. Passengers on board the Boeing 777, which departed Heathrow on Thursday evening, welcomed the resumption of direct flights as they landed at Tehran's Imam Khomeini International Airport. The service follows the relaxation of sanctions against Iran and the reopening of the British embassy in the Iranian capital last year, which was ransacked by protesters in 2011. And now for the general weather forecast around the Sultanate. Partially cloudy to cloudy skies will prevail over the coastal areas of the Governorate of Dhofar and its nearby mountains, with intermittent drizzle. Rest of the Sultanate will have clear skies with cloud accumulation over the Hajar Mountains. Low clouds and fog late at night and early morning are expected over most of the coasts of the Arabian Sea. Winds will be easterly to northeasterly light to moderate over the coast of Sea of Oman, while on the coastal areas of the Arabian Sea, it will be southwesterly moderate to active. Seas will be rough along the coasts of the Arabian Sea with a maximum wave height of 3 meters and slight along the rest of the coasts with a maximum wave height of 1 meter. This is the Sultanate of Oman television. Before we end tonight's bulletin, here are the main points once again. The national economy achieves a growth of 4% during the 8th five-year plan period. The funeral of the President of Uzbekistan takes place in his home city of Samarkand. And Malaysia confirms its first case of Zika virus. With that, we come to the end of tonight's news bulletin. From all of us here in the newsroom and the studios, it's good night.